Hello and welcome to part one of the lecture for Module 9. This is a bit longer lecture, so I'm just going to divide it up into part one and part two to make it a little easier. And although it's a longer lecture this week, you do not have any textbook reading. In fact, you don't have any textbook reading for Module 9, Module 10, or Module 11. So let's get started. Module 9 is on child neglect. We're going to talk about child abuse in Module 10. So we're going to cover some New York State law, definitions. We're going to talk quite a bit about the statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment, abbreviated SCR. We're going to talk a lot about the minimum degree of care, which is the standard of care in New York State. We're going to spend some time on excessive corporal punishment, children being exposed to domestic violence and how that relates to neglect. And then we're going to do some examples of neglect, kind of case specific. So let's get started. We're going to focus on New York State law. That's important because most students who study at Hudson Valley will end up practicing in New York State. Obviously, if you practice in another state, or especially if you practice in another country, you will need to ensure that you know the law, the policies, and the standards for whatever location you're working in. But we're going to focus on New York State law, not only for Module 9, but also for Module 10 and for Module 11. So Module 9, we're going to focus on child neglect and the statewide central register, otherwise known as the Child Abuse Hotline. New York State has very distinct definitions for child neglect as opposed to child abuse. So we're going to split those two very important topics into different modules. I hope that while we're discussing child neglect, it raises some questions in you about child abuse. I hope that that happens, and then we'll address those issues in Module 10. In Module 11, we're going to focus on child protective services in New York State and mandated reporters. So before we do anything involving children, we have to figure out what is a child. So for purposes of child abuse and neglect, in New York State, a child is a person less than 18 years old. So once a child in New York State turns 18, they can no longer be neglected or abused. So people legally responsible for a child in New York State must provide the minimum degree of care for that child until she or he reaches their 18th birthday. Now, New York is distinct from other states in one respect, and that's child support, meaning financial obligations for children in New York State last until the child is age 21. So it's very common in divorce decrees to have child support arrangements that require the parents to provide financial support to children until they're age 21. But that does not mean that that standard applies to child abuse and neglect. Child abuse and neglect only applies to children in New York State until they reach their 18th birthday. So the New York statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment is quite a mouthful, which is why we refer to it as the SCR for Statewide Central Register. It's most commonly referred to as the Child Abuse Hotline. So in New York State, all allegations of child neglect or abuse must be made to the state hotline. If the SCR accepts a report of alleged child abuse or neglect, they then forward that report to the right county, and that county's Child Protective Services unit conducts the investigation. So the hotline is operated by the state. Child Protective Service workers are employed by their individual counties. The hotline was created back in 1974, and it's located in Albany. So the Albany hotline serves all of New York State, including New York City. And the SCR operates as a function of law. Well, what does that mean? The SCR doesn't operate because a commissioner of an agency thought it was a good idea to have this hotline, or that someone created a policy that created the hotline. The hotline was created by law. It was created by the New York State Legislature back in 1973. And the law requires the SCR to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's required by law. So if the SCR is not open, it is actually violating the law. So the SCR is always open. It did not close during 9/11. It did not close during the Great Blackout of 2003. Some of you may remember that summer where most of New England lost its power for several days. The SCR had to continue to operate. If anything happens in the building where they're located, the building's being painted or there's a flood, the SCR cannot close. It is required to be open by law 24/7, 365. So because the SCR was created by law, the legislature also decided who the SCR can take reports against and what those reports are about. What is the criteria for those reports? And the law sets two standards that the SCR must follow. The first is that the SCR can only accept a report of child abuse or neglect if the allegations the caller makes meets the legal definition of child abuse and neglect. Those terms are defined by law, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time learning those definitions. So for example, if someone calls the hotline and says, Johnny, who's age 12, is being neglected because his parents took away his Xbox and his cell phone, well, that doesn't meet the legal requirements for child neglect or abuse. Therefore, the SCR is not going to accept that as a report. In fact, they can't. That would be violating the law. So a caller must make allegations that meet the legal definition of child neglect or abuse. That's the first criteria. The second criteria is who can be the subject, who is the alleged perpetrator of that child neglect or abuse. And the New York State Legislature created a law that says the only people who a report can be taken against are parents, custodians, guardians, or other people over age 18, 18 or older, who are legally responsible for a child. So in order for the SCR to accept a report of child neglect or abuse, both criteria must be met. The allegations must meet the legal definition of child neglect or abuse, and the person who's alleged to have abused or neglected a child must be a parent, a custodian, a guardian, or another person 18 or older who is legally responsible for a child. For example, if a child's walking down the street and a stranger pulls up in a car, gets out of that car and punches that child repeatedly and then drives away, if a caller makes that call to the SCR and explains that's what's happened, the SCR cannot accept that report because the person who punched the child is a stranger to the child. They are not a parent, custodian, guardian, or someone else who's responsible for that child legally. So therefore, the SCR could not accept that report. So let's break this down just a little further. So we know there's three types of people a report can be taken against. The first is a parent. A parent can be any age. The youngest parent I've seen in a report was 11 years old. This 11-year-old had had a child. She, as could probably be expected, was not taking care of that child to the legal standard, and a report was made against her. So a parent can be any age. They can be any age that's old enough to have a child, and that parent can be male or female, regardless of age. This can also include, of course, adoptive parents and step parents. If you are any type of a parent, you are a parent and a report can be made against you. Guardian and custodians, we don't have to get tied up in what these terms mean legally, but what we do know is you are only a guardian or a custodian if a court has issued a legal order declaring you to be a guardian or a custodian. So of course, if the court has said you have a legal relationship with a child and you're not providing the minimum standard of care for that child, then a report can be made against you. So we've got parents, guardians, and custodians. The third category is a lot more gray. It's a lot more kind of ethereal. So the third category is any other person 18 or older who has regular and meaningful caretaking responsibilities for a child. And regular and meaningful, although it sounds kind of vague, we actually have had some court cases that have helped us define that. And again, what the SCR is trying to focus on are those people who have legal responsibilities for a child. For example, if the SCR is trying to figure out if the caller is describing someone who fits this category, they're going to try to figure out does this person who's 18 or over, do they spend time alone with the children where they're the only person responsible for them? Do they transport the children to and from school? Do they have access to the child's educational records? Are they on the emergency contact list? Can they come up and show up at the school at any time and pick the child up? Is this a person who takes a child to medical appointments and has access to a child's medical records? It's that sort of relationship we're trying to capture. Not just a babysitter who babysits the children once a month while the parents have a date night. That person would not be legally responsible. They only watch the children a couple hours a month. However, if you have a babysitter who's 18 or older who watches the children several nights a week, every week, and is solely responsible for making decisions for that children when they're with them, that person could be designated a person legally responsible for those children. So how many calls does the SCR receive every year? And as a second question, how many reports of neglect or abuse does the SCR accept every year? So I'm just going to give you a couple seconds to think about that. Just take a guess in your head or jot it down on a piece of paper. How many calls do you think the SCR receives every year? And remember, they receive reports and calls from all over New York State, including New York City. And once you put that number down on a piece of paper, I want you to write down how many reports of neglect and abuse do you think the SCR accepts every year? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Well, let's look at 2019. In 2019, the SCR received 310,000 phone calls in the year 2019. Now that number's been rounded up to the nearest whole, but 310,000 phone calls in 1 year. That's almost heading toward 1,000 calls every day. So that's a lot of phone calls. But that doesn't mean they accept 310,000 reports. Because remember our criteria. When those people are making those 310,000 phone calls, the staff at the SCR has to figure out, are the allegations the caller making, does it meet the definition, the legal definition of child abuse or neglect? If it does, the SCR staff has to ask a second question, which is the alleged perpetrator of the abuse a parent, a guardian, a custodian, or another person 18 or older who's legally responsible for the children? And those questions result in the SCR accepting 195,000 reports in 1 year. That's a lot of reports. Every one of those reports that's accepted is then sent to the right county for investigation by Child Protective Services. But if you look at the difference between 310,000 and 195,000, it's roughly 100,000 calls a year that don't result in a report being taken. So why were so many reports rejected in 1 year? Well, it's because of our criteria. Because either the alleged perpetrator was not a parent, custodian, guardian, or other person legally responsible for the child, or the allegations did not meet the legal definition of neglect or abuse. So what is child neglect? What is the legal definition in New York State of child neglect? Well, the definition can be a little complicated, so we're going to break it up into a couple of parts. The first part is to understand the definition of child neglect in New York State. You have to know and understand the standard of minimum degree of care. This is the standard the New York State legislature has put into law, saying this is the minimum standard parents and other people legally responsible for children must meet. So parents are required by law to provide their children with the minimum degree of care. And guardians, custodians, and any other person over 18 deemed legally responsible for children are also required by law to provide them with the minimum degree of care. It's kind of obvious I'm emphasizing the word law here, right? I'm really trying to emphasizing for you, this is a legal standard. This is not a good idea. It's not a policy decision. It's not a decision that one politician made or didn't made. This is actually in the law. So parents in New York State and anyone else who's legally responsible for a child is required to provide that child with the minimum degree of care. And you're about to discover it truly is a minimum. It's not the ideal way we would want parents to care for their children. It's not the best way. Sometimes it's not even a good way. It is a very low standard of care. So what does the minimum degree of care include? Well, this is what the legislature has decided it includes: food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, adequate supervision, and no excessive corporal punishment. That's what the minimum degree of care is, and that's what people who are legally responsible for children in New York State have to provide. So let's look at each one of those categories. Food. Remember, these are minimal requirements. So food means the basic requirements for humans to survive. It can be the same food every day. It does not have to be varied. It does not have to be nutritious. It could be fast food 3 times a day. It does not have to be the child's favorite foods. It does not have to include yummy things like desserts and treats. It is the minimal amount of food that is required to meet the basic needs of a child's survival. Remember, we're talking minimal standards here. Clothing. Well, we all know how kids feel about clothing, especially when they're teenagers, right? But the clothing requirement from a legal standard is the basic clothing appropriate for New York State weather, which means shorts and tees for summer and warmer clothes like coats, warm shoes, boots, hats, gloves for the winter time. Clothes do not have to be fashionable. They do not have to be trendy. They do not have to be the new thing that everybody has. They do not have to be new, and the child does not have to like it. It is the minimal standard of clothing. Issues about clothing often lead to talking about children's hygiene. Do children need to be constantly and consistently clean and tidy in New York State? No, the minimum standard does not require that. Children can be dirty. They can have mud on them when they're playing. Of course, children get dirty throughout their day. Babies get messy throughout their day. Hygiene is kind of an interesting issue in the law because how do we dictate hygiene? Does a child have to have a shower every day? Do they have to have a shower at night before bed? The law doesn't get that specific, but we'll talk about how hygiene's related to neglect when we do some specific examples. Shelter. Shelter must meet the minimum code requirements. So what does code mean? Code means whatever standard that city, town, village, county has put into law. So it's really about structural safety. It means in New York State there has to be heat in the wintertime. Homes need to have electricity, running water, there has to be a working toilet, and there has to be a shower, tub, some sort of facilities that children can bathe in. However, remember, these are minimal standards. The house can be messy, it can be ugly, and it can smell bad. It's preferable that each child has his or her own bed, but that is not required by law. So many of you may have seen the show Hoarders on television. Hoarders is a very interesting show that shows people who have a mental illness related to hoarding will fill their homes with so much stuff and garbage that it actually creates a health hazard for the people who have to live there. It also creates safety issues, right? If people cannot get in a home safely, that means that emergency medical services can't get in a home and help someone who's having a medical emergency. It also means that children and adults can't get out of a home safely if there's a fire. If there's so much mess in a house that windows are blocked and doors are blocked, that creates a serious safety issue for the people living there. So if you've seen that show and you know the extent of destruction I'm talking about, that's clearly inadequate shelter. That type of shelter does not meet the minimum standard in New York. But in order for shelter to reach the level of neglect, it really needs to be unsafe. That's really the standard we're looking at. Medical care. Children are entitled to have basic medical care. Medical care can include dentistry, surgery, optical care, mental health services, and substance abuse treatment. For example, if you have a teenager who's profoundly depressed or suicidal or is doing self-injurious behavior like cutting, that child needs to see a mental health professional. And that's part of the required care a parent and people otherwise legally responsible need to provide for a child. Another example is a child who's abusing drugs or alcohol, a teenager 12, 14, 16 years old who's getting drunk on a regular basis to the point of intoxication, who's smoking marijuana, who's using other drugs. That child needs substance abuse treatment. That also falls under the umbrella of medical care. So children are required to receive basic medical care. When I talk about required medical care with people in training sessions, people often ask, well, what about parents who can't afford it? We all know how incredibly expensive medical care can be, and there's medical providers out there who won't help an adult or a child who doesn't have adequate medical insurance. And those of us who are lucky enough to have good medical insurance know that even that doesn't cover everything. And even with good insurance, medical care can still be very expensive. So the way this is looked at by Child Protective Services is that children need to have basic medical care. If a parent cannot afford to pay for that care out of pocket, or they don't have medical insurance, or they don't have adequate medical insurance, if the county offers to provide that help to a parent to enroll a child in New York State's Child Health Plus program or other public benefits so the child can get that medical care, if a parent refuses that help, then that is neglect. Although every parent may not be able to afford it, if parents are offered assistance and refuse it and refuse to take that help so their child can get that medical care, that in fact is neglect. Education. So kids are required to go to school. New York State has mandatory education requirements, and one of the requirements involves when a kid has to start school. So in New York State, children must be enrolled in school no later than the year of their 6th birthday. So whatever year they're turning 6, they need to be enrolled in school. And because New York State has mandatory education, it provides parents with a couple of choices. The first and most common one is public school. We all pay for public schools by our taxes, and the majority of parents take advantage of that by letting their kids go to public school. A second option is a religious school that's accredited by the New York State Department of Education. The third option is home instruction that's approved by the New York State Department of Education. Now, this is kind of a confusing topic lately because we've got kids on all sorts of crazy school schedules right now, right? They're in school live, they're at home sometimes, they're all over the place. But DOE, Department of Education approved home instruction is actually really difficult. That means the child is not enrolled in a school in any way, shape, or form, part-time or full-time. The child is 100% being taught every topic, every bit of material by their parent. And the parents don't just get to freestyle and teach the kid what they want and how they want it. It's actually an extremely structured program. The parents are required to submit a ton of paperwork to the New York State Department of Education. There's strict requirements about testing and levels that students must be able to demonstrate they can meet. It's really extremely difficult for parents to do, which is why an awful lot of parents don't do it. Home instruction is not letting a kid stay home and play video games all day. So that's a lot of times where we see problems with education not meeting the minimum degree of care. So kids have to be enrolled by the year of their 6th birthday. They get 3 choices: public school, a religious school, or Department of Education approved home instruction. It kind of depends where you live in New York State to determine how old a child has to be before they can quit school. So each school district in New York State gets to decide for itself whether children have to be enrolled through their 16th birthday, the school year that includes their 16th birthday, or their 17th birthday. Do you know how many school districts in New York State? About 700. So there's about 700 different answers to how old a child has to be before they can quit school. But in New York State, we know it has to be either age 16 or age 17. So in New York State, kids have to be enrolled in one of the acceptable choices from their 6th birthday through either their 16th or 17th birthday. New York State has a very strict definition. It's one where we really get a black and white definition about what it means for parents to not meet the minimum degree of care in relation to education. And in New York State, what we call educational neglect is directly tied to attendance. So here we actually have a nice, neat definition for you. Educational neglect in New York State means a child is missing excessive amounts of school without a valid reason. And as a result of those excessive absences, the child is failing classes, failing a grade, or not receiving essential services. For example, if that child's required to receive speech therapy or special education services and they're not getting those services because they're absent all the time, that's educational neglect. If someone were to call the SCR and say, well, this parent is neglectful because they don't help their child do their homework, or they don't enroll their child in activities and sports, or the parent never comes to parent-teacher night. None of that is educational neglect in New York State. The SCR won't even accept that report. In order for the SCR to accept a report about educational neglect, the caller has to inform the SCR that the child's missed excessive amounts of school without a valid excuse, and that as a result of their absences, the child is failing or not receiving essential services. Adequate supervision. This means the level of supervision required for each particular child. Now, I have a fun little trick question I give to people when I do training about child abuse and neglect, and I'll ask a group of people, what does New York State law say about how old a child has to be before they can be left alone at home, left alone outside, or left alone in a car? What does New York State law say is the age that children have to be alone? That's a trick question because there is no law. New York State has no law that dictates when children can be left alone at home, nor do we have any law that says when they can be unsupervised outside or left alone in a car when mom or dad runs into the grocery store. So, wow, this is going to be really hard to determine whether a parent's providing adequate supervision. But we do have 2 general rules that help us figure it out. One is any child that's left alone has to be able to respond effectively to an emergency. So for example, if Child Protective Services is talking to a child who's been left home alone, they're going to ask them lots of safety questions. What would you do if you were home and you saw a fire? What would you do if you smelled smoke? What would you do if you were home alone and someone knocked on the door? and you didn't know who it was. If you needed to call mommy or daddy, how do you call mommy or daddy if you need to ask them a question or need help? They're going to ask them all those safety questions. And if those children say really unsafe things like, well, if anyone knocks on the door, I'm going to let them in. Or if I see fire, I'm going to hide under my bed. Well, that child's indicating that they cannot be left safely alone at home. Some children as young as 11 are really mature and really able to make safe decisions. I would never answer the door when mommy and daddy's not home. The door stays locked and I don't answer it no matter what. I have a cell phone and I know how to call mommy and daddy if I need help. If there's a fire, I'm going to stop, drop, and roll, or I'm going to run outside and call 911. They give all those answers that show that this child's prepared to stay home alone. They may be safely at home for a couple of hours. It doesn't mean that they can be left home all night or all weekend or all week, but there are younger children who can be safely left home alone for a couple of hours. Of course, we all know teenagers, 16, 17 years old, that we'd never let be alone in our house, right? Because they've demonstrated they do not make good choices. They do not have good decision making. And if they're left home alone, they're going to have a keg party with all their friends. So it's not about a child's age strictly. It's about that child's maturity level and ability to respond to situations that can arise when they're home alone. Our second general rule is just because we've determined a child is safe to be left alone, that does not mean that child has the maturity or the wherewithal to take care of other children. So if we have a very mature 11-year-old who's shown that they can be left home alone safely for a couple hours, that does not mean that 11-year-old should be babysitting a 6-month-old or a 2-year-old. That may be very unsafe for even a mature child. And of course, we know young children, really young children, can't be left home alone for any period of time. Infants, newborns, toddlers, young school-age children always have to be supervised. No excessive corporal punishment. When I do training, no issue raises more conversation and more debate than corporal punishment. We've got some conflict in the law here, but we can work through it and I can help you sort it out. Of course, corporal just means physical. If you're using corporal punishment, it means you're using something physical to punish your child. Your child's being punished physically. So the New York State penal law, what we call the New York State criminal law, states a parent may use physical punishment to educate or discipline their child. So let's look at a criminal example. Say you're walking down the street and you don't know me from anyone, and I run up behind you and I take my hand and I smack you on the butt. Well, you can call the police and you can have me arrested. I am not allowed to smack you on the rear end without your permission and consent, and I can be arrested for that. But if I have an 8-year-old child and I use my hand to smack them on the butt, for purpose of educating or disciplining them, then that is legal under the New York State criminal law. However, the New York State law also says you cannot use excessive corporal punishment. So in New York State, you are allowed to physically discipline your own child. Note it says parents, right? We are not allowed to use physical discipline on other people's children. That could get us in trouble with the law. But parents are allowed to use physical corporal punishment on their own children if they're doing it to educate or discipline the child. However, the law says that physical discipline cannot be excessive. Well, what the heck is excessive? We've had a lot of court cases over the years that have helped us gather factors we can use to determine if punishment has been excessive. Obviously, if a parent has left a child with a bloody nose, with bruises, with fractures, we would all agree that that's excessive. That's obvious examples. But what about less obvious examples? How do we determine from a legal perspective whether a parent's physical punishment is excessive. Well, here's the factors we can use. It's really important you know these factors. There's only half a dozen or so, and you have to use the actual name of the factor, okay? I'm giving you a hint here that this is going to appear on a quiz and probably your final. So you need to know these factors by name. Our first factor is the age of the child. Obviously, it's very important when you're determining if punishment has been excessive, how old is the kid? While it may be appropriate to spank a 10-year-old child on the buttocks, it's never appropriate to spank a 6-week-old, right? So the age of a child is very important. Physical punishment is never acceptable on very young children. Newborns and infants can never receive a physical punishment for any reason. It's just not safe. And it's legal to use physical punishment on a toddler, a 2, 3, 4-year-old, but of course it must be done with great restraint. These children aren't even fully developed, so punishing them in a physical manner must be done with great care. So the age of the child is one factor. Intellectual development is another factor. The child must have the intellectual ability to understand why they're being punished. If a parent's using physical discipline to educate or to discipline, then the child has to understand action and consequence. If you have a child who has an intellectual disability and they have no understanding of why they're being spanked, then they can't be educated or disciplined with that method, right? Because they don't even understand why they're being punished. So intellectual development is an important factor. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that children with intellectual and other disabilities can't be disciplined. I would never say that. There are, of course, methods like taking away electronics and games, putting children in timeout, taking away privileges. There's all sorts of ways you can discipline a child, even a child who has intellectual disabilities. But physical punishments are inappropriate for children who cannot understand why they're being punished. So intellectual development is another factor. Physical ability. Now, my sister, when my nephew was growing up, often punished him by making him do push-ups. He would be disrespectful or not do something he was supposed to do, and she'd say, "Drop and give me 10 push-ups." My nephew was very fit. He played a lot of sports in school, and it was not a big deal for him to have to do 10 or 20 push-ups. A lot of parents will tell an active child, "Look, you're driving me crazy. You're not doing the things I need to ask you to do. You need to go outside and you need to run 10 laps around the house." That's a perfectly appropriate punishment for a child who's a fit and active child. Of course, it's never appropriate, and it's always excessive corporal punishment to force even a fit child to exercise in extreme temperatures or conditions. So if it's 100 degrees out, it's excessive punishment to tell a child they have to go outside and run 5 miles, even if that child's fit, because it's just too extreme of a temperature. And physical exercise may be considered excessive punishment if a child is just incapable of doing that type of exercise. A child who's obese or who has a physical disability or some other issue who's not capable of doing that exercise, well, that's excessive to ask that child to do physical exercise as a punishment. So physical ability is another factor. Endurance. We want to know if the punishment being inflicted on the child exceeds their endurance. So a punishment is excessive if it exceeds more than a child can withstand. For example, making a toddler 3 years old sit in a corner for 2 hours. That is so unreasonable for a child who's that age, who can barely sit still for 2 minutes, right? So trying to force them to sit in a corner for 2 hours is excessive. Having a child hold a weight over their head for a long time, making a child kneel on raw rice. I see this pretty frequently in my work. If you've never tried it, I recommend trying it. It's incredibly painful, more painful than you might think. Or requiring a child to stay in their room for several days, telling a child they have to spend 3 days in their room and they're only allowed to leave to go to the bathroom. and they have to eat all their meals in the room. That's excessive for a young child. Now, making a child spend several hours in their room, well, that's certainly appropriate. So endurance, the extent of the punishment or the degree of the punishment, is certainly a factor. We also want to look at what is the parent feeling and experiencing while they're punishing the child. So one of the factors is the parent in control of themselves, or are they enraged? Are they extremely angry? So parents administering physical punishments should be calm and in control of themselves. If they are lashing out at a child physically because they're enraged or extremely angry, that punishment may be deemed excessive because the parent's out of control. And parents who are out of control, who are physically punishing their children, are not trying to educate or discipline their children. They're trying to release their rage. So whether the parent's in control or enraged is one of the factors we want to consider. Another factor is it discipline or is it humiliation? Now remember, the law allows corporal punishment to educate or discipline. It doesn't say you can use corporal punishment to humiliate a child. So, for example, a child is 10 years old and he keeps wetting the bed at night, and the parent is so upset about this that they take the child's urine-soaked sheets, they shove them in the child's backpack, and they make the child take those urine-soaked sheets to school. Well, there's nothing educational about that. That is not going to help the child stop wetting the bed. The only purpose of doing something like that is to humiliate the child. So if a physical punishment is meant to humiliate a child, it may be deemed excessive. So just two more notes on excessive corporal punishment. One thing that comes up when I do training on this topic is that many people have different religious and cultural values around corporal punishment. You often hear expressions like, well, the Bible says, spare the rod, spoil the child, meaning you have to physically discipline your child in order to make them behave. There is lots of cultural and religious issues around corporal punishment. So we have to have CPS workers, Child Protective Services workers, who have knowledge about people's religions and cultures in order to effectively work with those people. However, it doesn't change the legal standard. If the New York state law, interpreting that law, deems a punishment to be excessive, then it's excessive and it can be neglect. And that happens regardless of the parents' religious or cultural values. So we want our CPS workers to be culturally informed about people's different belief systems and the social norms within their community, but it does not change the legal standard. The other note on excessive corporal punishment is a bit about the use of objects and other items. The law does not say you cannot use an object like a belt or a ruler or a cell phone cord to discipline a child. It doesn't say that. But it's strongly discouraged. And the main reason is because if you use your hand to spank a child, you can feel with your hand how hard you're striking that child. You yourself feel it. If you use something like a plastic coat hanger or a extension cord, you can't feel how hard that cord is striking that child. So parents who use objects often hurt children much worse than they intended to. Okay? So use of objects is strongly encouraged. So is what I call creative physical punishment. Things like forcing a child to eat hot sauce, putting soap in a child's mouth, those sorts of other creative punishments can be very dangerous. You can Google these sorts of punishments and you will find cases where a parent has forced a child to put chili powder in their mouth and the child has aspirated that chili powder, meaning it didn't go down their esophagus and into their stomach, it actually went into their lungs, and children have died from that. Making a child eat anything that's not meant to be eaten, like putting soap in their mouth, can also be very dangerous. Children have all sorts of allergies and reactions to things that we don't know about until they happen. So it's strongly discouraged in the law to do these creative kind of physical things to children that could have unexpected and very dangerous or even fatal results. So that's the minimum degree of care: food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, adequate supervision, and no excessive corporal punishment. We're going to end part one right here. And as soon as you start part two, we're going to put together how minimum degree of care fits in with the definition of child neglect.